Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome for joining us today for our World Water Week session on research and innovation priorities for climate adapting humanitarian WASH. It is a joy to welcome you to this session. And as we now wait for people to start slowly trickling in, let me first introduce myself. My name is Vi Wynn, and I'm the Humanitarian WASH Innovation Manager here at Elrha. It would also be great to be introduced to you, our audience. So please do take this time to introduce yourselves and where you're calling in from the world from today in the chat function. A very warm welcome to all of you. Now, just some housekeeping rules before we start. If at any point throughout the session you have any questions or comments that you would like to share with us, and we do encourage this throughout the session, please do post these in the chat, and we'll be sure to monitor these and respond to them throughout the session, and especially during our Q&A at a later stage. I can see that some more people are slowly joining us and trickling in. So for those that are just joining us, a very warm welcome to you. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, and welcome to our World Water Week session. So this is a 1 hour session where we will be sharing key findings from a new report, which is a first of its kind agenda highlighting 11 research and innovation priorities for adapting humanitarian WASH response to climate change, which is a very fitting theme for World Water Week this year. Now, this report is now live to download, and we're delighted to be launching it today throughout this session. So on the screen, you'll see a QR code to access and download it from the Elrha website. And if my colleague Zainab can also share the link as well, there's also a link where you can access and download the report. This report is based on a 1 year study that was commissioned by Elrha and delivered and led by Oxfam and the ADAPT initiative. And it outlines key evidence gaps where the humanitarian WASH sector can develop more effective research and innovation efforts to protect vulnerable communities from the escalating impacts of climate change on essential WASH services. Now, you'll hear more about this later on throughout this session, but this report is based on multiple strands of evidence gathering. So through literature review, interviews, focus group discussions, and an extensive global consultation with the humanitarian WASH sector. And we're absolutely delighted to be sharing the key findings with you today. So in terms of the order for today, I'm joined by Andy Bastable, Oxfam's Head of Water and Sanitation, who will be sharing key findings from this report before we go into a 15-minute Q&A with the research team who led this study. So that's Andy Bastable and Laurence Hamaï from Oxfam and Paul Knox-Clark from the ADAPT initiative. They'll be here to answer any questions or comments or reflections that you may have. So please do drop your questions and reflections into the chat throughout the session, and we'll address those in the Q&A. Andy will then go through an example of how the findings from this report have actively been used to inform other work before we wrap up and close the session. I'd also like to thank the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for supporting and making this work possible. Next slide, please. So just to set the scene, there were a number of key learning questions that we wanted this report to address and respond to from the outset, which would add value to the research and innovation efforts of practitioners, policymakers, and researchers working within humanitarian WASH response. So these key questions were: where are the critical research and innovation gaps for adapting humanitarian WASH to climate change? Where can research and innovation play a significant role in climate adapting humanitarian WASH response? And where should humanitarian practitioners, researchers, and donors focus their efforts and resources on adapting humanitarian WASH response to a changing climate? So these were the guiding questions to this report. And to share some insights to these questions, I would like to now introduce and pass over to Andy Bastable from Oxfam, who was key in leading this study. Over to you, Andy. Next slide,
Thank
please.
you. Zainab, the next slide, please. Yeah, just to say that this climate adaptation research was basically to find it's like a gap analysis of what's happening in the field and what are the gaps in knowledge and practice at the field level. So that's what it kind of panned out to be. And to set the scene, the current impact on climate change on WASH, um, increased. It's all about the major thing is water insecurity. So decreased water quality and quantity in many other places, increased waterborne diseases. Well, it's not just waterborne diseases, it's many diseases, and all of the mosquito vectors are set to increase substantially, disrupted water supplies, not just from droughts, but from floods, stress on sanitation facilities, either because they're flooded or there's no water for the transportation of the sewage. And that we can't ever forget that it's not a homogeneous impact. It will affect more vulnerable communities and more vulnerable parts of communities more than others. And then 20 million people are already displaced each year due to climate-related disasters. Next slide, please. So the general overview here is that yes, as I said, the major impact is on water insecurity, but look at all the other things. Kind of, it affects everything. Water, of course, affects everything, and the food conflict. We do expect more conflict in the future because of climate. Related resource shortages. Yeah, so displacement, gender, disease, it incorporates all things. So it's not just about WASH. Next slide, please. So this is the methodology in our little kind of upside down funnel of first of all, it started with a literature review, which was mainly done by Laurence Camaille, who's ready to answer questions on this call. Um, uh, then kind of we have a steering group, and out of the literature review, there's 21 broad areas that got identified as needing attention from the literature. And then after a steering group prioritization with inputs from key informants, then we got down to just 7 of the major prioritizations. And then there was a number of in-country focus group discussions covering over 300 practitioners, and that's in about 16 countries. They're all kind of humanitarian countries because this is looking at humanitarian climate change adaptation. And then the key informants took what came out of that, and from that we produced a global survey, which we got 181 responses, which people then could rank under each of the 7 major topics. There was a series of issues, and then people had to rank them, and from that we get to the results. Next slide, please. So this is just going back a step to the 7 from the literature review and from steering group inputs. There was 7 major topics that a lot of the bullet points and the various individual kind of issues went into the global survey. So the first one, rising disease burden. I'm not sure I need to even explain that, but yeah, hotter environments mean more breeding of viruses and bacteria, and therefore more mutations. And then we have wash inequalities. So we already know that well, the planet is very unequal, and that this shocks to the system through climate change shocks just exacerbates that already very unequal kind of system that we have. Um, Water demand versus supply, another very obvious one. More contaminated water and more risks, and that's floods and droughts. Um, Behavior insights, understanding more the drivers and the blockers for behavioral change um, in a climate change lens, um, shrinking of sources. Um, yeah, there are many other things in there around more algal blooms and more potential for contamination, and then uncertain futures. So this one was in here and it had quite a lot of feedback on this business about because the future is uncertain, because the climate change predictions are quite far in the future. Some of them, not all of them, and many are happening right now. Um, Kind of people, it was felt that decision makers aren't making decisions because they haven't got the facts before them. Is that true or is that not true? If they were presented with undeniable facts for 5 years, 10 years in the future, would decision makers be making more decisions now? I'm not sure if they would. So, but there was a lot of discussion around that uncertain futures and making decisions in a very unpredictable future. Next slide, please. So this is a graph of the respondents, the 181 respondents to the global prioritization survey. And you can see that the majority of respondents came from Africa, which is where the majority of displaced people are, not all due to climate change, of course. And then secondly, MENA, and then thirdly, Asia. So the actual proportions of the geographical focus, um, I feel is correct. And just to reiterate that these this survey went to WASH practitioners. So this is not all WASH practitioners. So you've got the people at the field level, you've got people at the regional level, and then you've got headquarters level. And in the breakdown, and it's still in the annexes of the report, is who voted for what. And then we looked at were there big differences in what regional people voted or what one region voted and one region didn't vote, and there wasn't any really significant difference. Some countries have salinization problems, others don't. So, kind of, yeah, there was nothing that we could point to as a specifically regional uh, kind of response to these questions. So yeah, next slide, please. Um, so when we got the responses back from the global survey, this slide just represents how we, for some of them, not all of them, but to try and get somewhere near 11 priorities for research and innovation. The idea was to couple some of these together. So this is an example, these technologies and practices for water recycling and reuse. Well, that's partly kind of 98 people, and you can see 52% at country level, 55% regional, 58 HQ. So it's not that different, voted for this. And then you get the people who didn't vote for that. They voted for low cost grey water recycling systems. And we put those together. And that's why it became the number one issue. Another example of this is climate change risk assessment tools. And that wasn't just people felt that there was an absence of climate risk assessment tools. Some of it is decision support tools for sister communities, and integrating local and external knowledge. This is just an example to say how we grouped some of the issues to come up with 11 of the priorities. So next slide, please. So here we get to the uh, to the 11. So these priorities for research and innovation. So specifically, the question was what requires more research and innovation. We also, during this process um, in the global survey, asked people kind of about documentation and one, where do they go to find it? To what medium would they like it in? And that was all very interesting because nobody at the field level is going to go away and read a huge report. They all said, well, they would like a workshop, and then something they can read on their phone. Um, that was part of the workshops and the questionnaires, asking those questions and about what guidance documents that don't exist that they would like to see existing. So that was part of it. So number one, it was ranked easily. The highest one was around water conservation technologies, water conservation, including recycling. Some of the titles slightly changed over time, but yeah, basically the first one is how to conserve water, and that would include recycling. Two, barriers to wash access. And this is on a community level that due to climate change, means that some vulnerable groups who already have difficulty accessing water, it's going to become more difficult. How will it become more difficult? What are the barriers? What are the enablers also? And then number three is specifically on um, um, community engagement and triggers for not only communities, but decision makers, whether it's governments or whoever it might be. What are the triggers that will make them take some climate, either conservation or adaptation behaviors and initiatives? Um, Surveillance and wash linkages is an interesting one that was felt that was a weak element. It's a weak element now. And will it become stronger? Well, not with the climate change and not with the various cuts that have been happening over the last year. So, yeah, so that's still a big issue. And sustainable service models, number five. Um, that most people will know that sustainability in terms of service, of keeping your water network working, for keeping your toilets functioning, for keeping any infrastructure that you put in the field in a humanitarian situation to keep it working. I mean, because we're talking humanitarian, but pretty much all of the current emergencies that we respond to are long, protracted emergencies. So sustainability is as bigger issue for us as it is for people in the development sector. So this is about, well, kind of um, what are the best service delivery models that can withstand the shocks of climate change, meaning droughts, more floods, um, all the problems associated with extreme heat. What is it that could be tweaked in these service delivery models that would make them more resilient to climate change shocks? And on a community level, then we get to number six, which is coping strategies. So, what are kind of communities' existing coping strategies? How could they be tweaked and supported to make them more effective? And that very closely links in with number seven. And we had many debates about do we merge number six and number seven? Um, but in the end, we decided to keep them separate because the indigenous knowledge subject becomes more about how you get indigenous knowledge, how you have it as part of your initial assessment and thinking and whole program cycle. And we talk about, yes, involving the community all the way through the program cycle, but it doesn't happen as systematically as we like. So, like many of these are kind of existing problems that the wash sector has now that will be exacerbated by climate change, and therefore we need to do better. Or we could say, well, this is an opportunity to do it better based on a climate change, new shocks, you know. In the future. Number eight is similar to what I've just said, that WASH impact evaluation. I know that many agencies have been real focused on the process of response, but to get back to what is the impact? Now, when we started this research about over a year ago, yeah, it was a year and 8 months ago, that there wasn't many examples beyond raised latrines and a few other flooding type initiatives that we could call a wash adaptation to climate change. It was different to normal practice because normal practice is responding to droughts and responding to floods. It's not actually normal practice to respond to extreme heat. So that becomes a bit different. But yeah, to get back into saying right now, we have a few more examples of actual activities in the field in WASH to be more resilient to climate change shocks. Then are they being evaluated in this impact? Is this the best thing that we can do? It's a good topic. Um, and also linked in with behavioral triggers is hygiene behavior drivers. Again, what are the triggers for people to change or tweak how they do their wash related activities? Number 10, watershed mapping. And that is even in a humanitarian context, we believe that there has to be a much more holistic view at where does the water come from? How is it recharged? Whether it's a watershed or it's groundwater, like nobody should be. I mean, it's for the last 30 years, people have been saying you should not be drilling a borehole unless you've done your aquifer assessment and you know the inputs, the aquifer and the outputs, and therefore you can set your pumping regime appropriately so you don't exhaust the aquifer. Well, it's the same for land and a watershed, and what measures are there in there to conserve water, for tree planting, all of these things that humanitarians have said, oh, we're too busy rushing around responding to get the basics right. Whereas nowadays you think, well, we can do better than just run around doing the basics. We have to consider the long-term impacts of everything we do. And as I said before, all of our humanitarian responses are protracted crises. So therefore, it's essential that every response has this as part of it. Number 11 came in strongly, very strongly with the countries that suffer from it. And there's some countries that don't, so it didn't come in strongly. But it is one of these things where at the moment, there is no low cost way of doing desalination. I mean, as Oxfam, we've tried many things with capacitative deionization and simpler methods of doing desalination. We still haven't reached a point where we could get to the same salt concentrations as reverse osmosis treats, but then that's an expensive technology and it has lots of consumables that you cannot buy in most kind of water stressed countries. So that was, this comes in number 11 because it's most definitely a a um a subject which requires both research and innovation. Yeah, and the majority of the 11 before you are there because it's not just a research or it's not just innovation, but it's a bit of both. Um, to understand the situation in the greatest detail we can will help us then find the best possible response. So there's one more, isn't there? Yeah, there's a couple more. Next slide then, please. So key message, kind of, for me, it's super resilient infrastructure. Um, but I think one of the big things coming out of this research is, as I said earlier, about um, climate change. The shocks of climate change are not going to affect everybody in a country, in a region of that country, in a community the same. So we have to be a bit targeted um, with how we respond to actually figure out who is the most vulnerable and focus on them first. That would be, a big kind of push coming out of this. And secondly, um, the holistic view, I think, of the the situation we're facing, um, and that overpumping of aquifers, overpumping near coastal areas, causing more saltwater in uh, kind of intrusion. These are huge problems right now, and they're only going to get worse. So does that mean we need more vigilance, more um, uh, legislation, perhaps in some countries? It might work in many of our humanitarian response countries. That I don't think that's an option, but something along those lines. Okay, next slide, please. So, the call to action here is that people use what is, it's not called a gap analysis, but it is a gap analysis. And the priorities clearly voted upon by WASH practitioners are clear. So therefore, the call here is very much to focus on what people have said is a gap. Now, some of those gaps we discarded because they weren't real gaps. They were gaps of the people in the field. And some of the workshops that I managed to get to, it's like, yes, this information does exist, but it doesn't, that they haven't got any access to it. They don't know where it is, or it exists as a little bit in many different places. So the idea of having a one-stop shop document on whatever it might be is required, and it's not there. It's like in lots of these forums, people said, "Oh, we haven't got enough information on how to make flood-resilient toilets." And I always thought there's loads of information out there that lots of agencies have done lots of things on different types of flood resistant toilet. But it's true, once I got looking, that there isn't a one-stop shop document on climate change and excreta disposal. Now there will be, but I'll come to that later. So yeah, so the push behind this research is here's what the people at the field level have said are their priorities, and therefore we should focus our attention, our money, and our time on responding to these 11 priority areas rather than being pushed because some donor wants to put some money into water treatment or whatever it might be, being pushed in that direction. So it's trying to focus all of us on the gaps rather than just kind of cool, sexy ideas that come along and you think, oh, yes, that would be interested to research into. But the push is to focus on what the field people think are the main gaps. And the next slide is time for questions. Um, so based on all of what I've just said, and it won't be just me answering any questions, um, but based on what I've just said, um, are there any questions? And I know I can see that there's lots of stuff in the chat, and I can talk and read the chat at the same time. Um, so, has
Andy, there is a several question I can start answering if you want.
okay, carry on.
So the first question I've seen is about the change in local climate and the fact that this change can be existing elsewhere. And do we need to transfer knowledge from area that are already flooded or are arid? And the question was whether any topics that appear to be new, that means it's not already existing somewhere else. The answer to that, no. In literature review and the discussion, there is nothing very new. It's already existing somewhere or in one country or in one region. There is a gap that were actually in most steps of the research, extreme heat. There was some gap into it because they were not really examined apart from the impact of extreme heat on the body, human bodies. But the fact that extreme heat does affect also the wash system, like motors can be burning or faster, or you may have maybe the wastewater treatment will be facilitated by the extreme heat, who knows? But your infrastructures, whether it's pipes, whether it's tanks, the pumps, and so on, they will be also affected by the extreme heat. You may have trucks that will be down, so you cannot do water trucking in the middle of the day. People who need to respond to humanitarian wash activities may not be able to work during the day. And we are working in place where you have security issues, where you do have restricted times where you can intervene. So there is a lot of things regarding extreme heat that were not really appearing anywhere. So that's something that is remain to be analyzed.
Okay, I'll take one.
Could I just add to that one, actually,
Okay,
Andy?
yeah, right.
Unless you were going to speak to that question particularly. No, because I think, thank you, Brian, for that, because I think it's a really good question. It is actually one that we wrestled with as a team and had quite a lot of conversations about, the question of what's new. Um, and the big one, as Laurence has said, is extreme heat. Um, but I just wanted to add another couple of things that came up there. Whilst there, so the second point, in addition to extreme heat, is that whilst flooding isn't new, for example, or tropical storms aren't new, the frequency or location or scale of them is so different from what we've experienced, or will be so different from what humanitarians have experienced in the past, that actually it sort of nullifies the some of the response approaches. So, if something is big enough, it's different really in terms of scale. If it's urban, for example, um, it means that you have to respond in very different ways because of the density of I mean, you know all this, but the density of the population, the fact that certain resources aren't going to be available because they're going to have been destroyed. Um, Early warning systems stop working if things become more frequent. So with tropical storms, you don't get 72 hours of warning now. You get, increasingly you get much less than that. So whilst the things aren't new in terms of floods aren't new, the nature of them makes them effectively different from things that we've responded to in the past. So that's the second point. Um, and then the third point is, and maybe we'll expand on this a bit more in a second, that if you look at the list of 11, many of them, I would say the majority of them, are not about kit or technology. They're about human processes and social processes, which was a surprise to me because I'm not a WASH practitioner. I thought we'd have loads of stuff about tiger worms and fecal sludge management. But actually, the majority of things were either about the way that humanitarians work, so the processes of humanitarian action, or they were about social processes and distinctions within cultures between different groups, and particularly marginalized groups, which means that it's more complex than just taking a technology that works in Afghanistan and moving it to Zimbabwe, because so much of what was coming out, and I think we were all surprised about this, was that it's not just it's not we're not just worried about what the risks that climate change changes, but also, of course, about the way that it affects social change, and that is going to differ from one place to another. So that makes it harder to kind of just up something and pop it into another culture. Not that you're suggesting, Brian, that we do that, but just it was quite an important thing that came out. So heat, yes, but also bigger, more frequent makes it different, and also it's difficult to transfer some technologies because of the social and cultural embeddedness of those technologies.
This actually connect with another question from Brian regarding the local knowledge and the transfer from one area to the area. The thing is that why do you pay attention to the local knowledge? It's not only because they have experimented for a long time and it's adapted to the local custom and the local context. It's also the fact that because it's already integrated in the community, it's easier to build from it. But indigenous knowledge coming from another area is external. So you still have this issue of how to transfer external knowledge into the local communities so that there is a buy-in and it can be accepted.
Mm.
There is a question from Salma, actually. I don't know if you saw it, which is closely related, Laurence, to what you were just saying. And I wondered if you'd like to just pick up on that, or Andy, just run with that because kind of relates.
Yeah, it's really related in the fact that a lot of what we are facing when we introduce a new way of doing a new whether it's a new technology for the local people or it is about, I mean, it's easy to build something, but to operate and maintain in the long term, really have to pay attention to who are the people on the ground, what are they able to do, what they accept. And often we are facing difficulty regarding the cost of all of this. And so scientific innovation is okay, but when we want to introduce a new innovation, we don't have any information about in the long term, how does this technology is operating? What the type of breakdown we are going to face? How much money you need to bring in? Do you need to have a spare part that are specific and impossible to find? So you have a lot of issues. I mean, I saw there is a breakthrough on new innovation on this and that, but in the long run, something will work if people are able to operate and maintain without extra cost.
And
that's a problem. I mean, there is so many different innovations that appear about new ways of doing this and that. But the reality is that when we try to implement, is like, yeah, once it's breakdown, it's down, and it's not working anymore. We spend a lot of money for nothing,
and I
and the
think
people still face the same situation.
And I think, Selma, I think to your point, Lawrence, the that's why this particular issue came up, didn't it, as one of the 11? How what are practical ways in humanitarian WASH for bringing together local knowledge and contextual knowledge and the kind of scientific piece about climate change. I can't remember, Andy, which number it was, but I know it was one of the areas. And it came up, Selma, because it's a gap. It wasn't something where we found there is work being done, but it wasn't something where we found that there was, a large amount of accessible work. So there's plenty of work to do still in that, and we hope that people will do it. And maybe Salma, you're the person to take that one on.
Yeah. Okay. So, moving on from that one, Brian, your issue about grey water recycling. Yeah, this is what the people said, and then we are looking into it as Oxfam, and contacting various companies and seeing what they've got to offer, and realizing that there is nothing that deals with a very low cost version of grey water recycling, and then you get to the point that, well, where are you getting the grey water? That we spent over the last 30 years, a lot of time and effort decentralizing all of the toilet blocks, the wash blocks, and all of these things. And people don't want wash blocks anyway. They want individual showers, So to actually get our heads round, because it's easy to say, isn't it? If we can cycle more of the wastewater, then we'll have more water. Well, that's easy. But the issue of bringing the actual grey water together in one place to make it actually economically viable to kind of treat that water, and then what you're going to do with it, because there's still an enormous amount of stigma about people in many countries. They would not drink that water, and you think, okay, fine, we're not going to drink any recycled water, but then that can go for crops. Well, that depends on the area that you're in. So, as with most things in WASH, the more you get into it, the more it's not straightforward. But I mean, I'm not surprised that it got voted number one because it's an obvious thing. But the solutions that I would say that we're not there yet, which means that we need research, one to understand the context in which it could happen, and then to understand, well, if it's not going to be used for drinking, then you don't need a full kind of water treatment unit. You pretty much need a very effective grease trap. And then you can kind of use the water for many non-drinking sources. So, yeah, when we started this project, I also thought that we would be able to tap into some of the big engineering consultancies and say, "Ooh, what's a good idea about decreasing evaporation, for example, from reservoirs?" Because I had read about reservoirs being full of these little plastic balls to stop evaporation. And then you get into it and you think, well, these are kind of little ideas on the side of some of the big kind of water companies type thing, but it's not it's not well researched. And then you think, well, to make a low cost version of it, and you think, well, actually, the best thing you can do is provide shade by planting trees around reservoirs. Now, if all the leaves and everything then falls into in the reservoir, or it increases the likelihood of green as in carbon fines in the water that isn't properly got out by the time you chlorinate it, then you've got yourself another problem with chlorine mixing with some of the disinfection by some of the fine carbon elements. So there's a disinfection byproduct mixing with algal blooms and other fines, which can cause long-term cancer type problems. So,
Andy,
yeah.
you're
Cool.
talking about water, and I just note that Rana has put a question in that you won't have seen, which is that for the 11 priorities, it seems that water was the most highlighted compared to sanitation and hygiene. Did sanitation come up? Now, I think sanitation did actually come up quite a lot in some of those processes. So finding out which sanitation um, approaches work most effectively, getting indigenous knowledge about sanitation as well as water. So I think it was there, but I wondered if either you or Laurence had an answer there for Rana about the degree to which sanitation came up over the process and in the final 11.
Just a reminder that this 11 priority is about research and innovation. The thing is that some of the topics that came out for sanitation, we estimate that it was more, there is enough existing documentation to actually have some documentation done, guidance on sanitation and climate change. The same remark can be done regarding one of the questions from Brian about the fact that there is more water in agricultures or other services than in the domestic use. But the thing is that integrated water resource management also came out as the big topics in the various in the questionnaire. But there is not it's not an opportunity for research or innovation. There is enough about integrated water resource management, but be just a guidance specific for the humanitarian WASH. So that's something a bit different.
Yeah. I mean, I've been looking into FSM and climate change, and a lot of it is around the waste characterization. If it has less water, That's the big issue. It's got a lot of water or not much water in it. And it's get one about flooding. So it's all about preventing flooding. And then the other bit is about water scarce areas where you cannot have offset toilets to any degree because there's no way people are going to use their hard collected water for flushing their toilet. What a waste, you know. So, well, if you could use then recycled water for it, well, that would be better, but that's a whole lot of problems. So, yeah, there's less issues. Climate change primarily is a water resource issue. So, and that, yes, there are sanitation issues, but they are less, definitely. I think one of the other ones that is equally big, which the way that it came out, and maybe because it's WASH people answering the questionnaires, is around disease and disease control. Um, the rise in vectors. But okay, just to looking at the questions here and saying, well, kind of Richard saying, will, these little innovations that we're trying to promote and more research, is the scale of the problem that we're facing in developing countries so enormous that it won't make much difference? Well, that remains to be seen about how it pans out and the speed in which we get to a very untenable situation. And in the meantime, all I would say is hope is action. Yeah, we have to take action. We're trying to relieve the suffering of poor communities. Now, how that ends up in the future, that's very difficult to assess right now, isn't it?
And also just on that one, Richard's question, the research on movement, well, on conflict and movement is still quite ambiguous. But what seems to be the case, from my understanding, the research is that thus far there is a lot of movement related to migration. It's almost exclusively internal, so within borders, and it's generally from the countryside to not to capital cities, but to sort of smaller second level cities, district centres, and so on. That seems to be the trend in many countries. But what's really interesting, well, one of the things that's important about that, as well as interesting, is like many other climate things, people aren't just moving because of climate, not just because of water availability or extreme hazards. So what's happening is that climate is part of a bigger trend around urbanization to these cities. Um, and yes, it will probably get worse. And yes, many of the other stressors which are making people move will get worse as well. But there need to be solutions for, in the wash area and in shelter and many other areas for increased urbanization, peripheral, peri-urban settlements and so on. And it's not exclusively a climate problem. It's a problem. And probably not entirely beyond human wit to address if the politics and the money are in the right place. So this is a small contribution to much larger interconnected issues, I think.
Okay, so we're now going to move on from questions. There'll be a few more questions after the next couple of slides. So now I want to share the screen again and take us to the next slide. We hope. So the kind of in Oxfam and with Paul Knox-Clark, again, we took the findings from this Elrha research and kind of then had a big discussion with various people about, okay, so what could we do to produce kind of the guidance which they had said during the global questionnaire was a gap for them. And we were surprised. If you look down the list, it's a lot of behavioural change type of elements. We did expect it to be more kit-based and various technologies that needed, and it wasn't. What came out of the questionnaires was as it stands here, really roughly. So yeah, humanitarian integrated water resource management as number one. And I kind of explained why we need that, and that's crucial. Um, an overarching document on kind of WASH and climate change adaptation. Same, focus on what differences are there in public health promotion in a climate change kind of shocks future than the current version. Um, Passive cooling. Kind of Paul can answer questions on that if there's any questions about that. But we thought with number 4, passive cooling, and number 12, extreme heat, that it's such a big issue and it's the new thing, the thing which is a bit different for WASH, that we should kind of say more about it than just have it as part of the other guidance documents that we're creating. Um, Groundwater infrastructure and climate adaptation, climate change risk and community engagement. It's very similar to the public health promotion, but it is different. Communicating risk is different. Using climate change data that kind of in sort of, I think it was Brian's comments in the chat about and it's sort of how can we look at past climate data and then predict the future when the future is a resetting of the climate systems. A little bit would be the answer, but we want to know what's going on. And at the moment, there isn't enough active kind of climate data stations throughout the whole of Africa. They've lost their funding too. So we don't even have a very good analysis of how the current changes are happening. WASH and anticipatory action. The feedback from people in the field was very much, yes, we kind of understand what anticipatory action is, but we don't understand what are the triggers for the activation of the funds. And so this document is all about unpacking climate change triggers to put in your AA anticipatory action type proposals. Nature-based solutions, has an addendum to these are possible solutions for climate change shocks. Community integrated water resource management, which again is different from the general kind of humanitarian integrated water resource management. Nothing new, but the new thing about it is having a humanitarian version. FSM and climate change. Yeah. And then there's extreme heat. What do you do to save your life? Or, it's really to save the most vulnerable people in the community's life when you have a very extreme heat event. So that's what that one's about. So these are 12 topics that we're currently funded by GFFO, out of and it's one kind of product out of the Elrha research. We're working on those and they'll be finished by December, we hope. And 6 of them are having sort of field trials. So it's not just sort of doing these technical briefs and documents, not just doing them top down and saying, right, here you are. It's actually doing them and then trialing them in various countries to see if it all makes sense, the flow of the document, the step-by-step approach to how you make your WASH programming more resilient. And we are going to have some attempt at not just having big fat documents, but making them phone compatible and easy to access for people in the field who are only going to access them by phone. So these are the things that we're trying to kind of push. And it's just to explain this next step. I think that in the last year, we've seen many agencies doing more now. It started off a year ago in the talk, everybody talking about it. Then we've gone through lots of agencies making bits of guidance here and there, and hopefully now we're at the stage where we're going to see more practical examples in the field, because at the moment there aren't enough practical examples in the field of any wash and climate change activities. Yeah. So any sort of I'm just looking in the chat, and there's nothing new on this GFFO bit. So Paul, do you want to have a go at wrapping up this session? And where are the vectors from Brian comes in last. Um, uh, Now, that is a good point, because vector control is quite a big part of the public health promotion and the risk and community engagement. So it's number 3 and number 6. So it's in there, but it's part of the changing environment of diseases, rather than one itself. You could say that it could have been a brief on disease transmission and climate change. But yeah, they are part of some of the other briefs. So that's a fair point. Um,
And I think, Andy, you've also said in the past that there is actually quite good or very good guidance already by MSF, UNICEF, and others around the specifics of vector control. And that maybe is an area that actually how you do vector control doesn't change very much. It's more where you do vector control and when you do vector control that changes, specifically with arboviruses and mosquitoes.
yeah, no, that's a great point, because on some of the things that came out when we thought there were existing good documents on it, we thought, well, we won't do that. We're trying to deal with the gaps. Um, but on this, thank you, Rana, for the humanitarian development nexus. Uh, that's true that whatever we call it, it's now Nexus is fashionable. What will be fashionable next year? But either way, we want a more holistic view of humanitarian action, which always takes in the long-term impact of how you're programming. Um, is there going to be a shift from diarrhea? No, not really. That's still is such a big issue. Um, And yeah, so sphere and climate change, if you look on their website, they've done quite a lot actually. So already Sphere has done kind of a separate document on sphere and climate change, and I think it's very good. So that's worth looking at. Now, I'm not aware of um, um, any date when they're going to do a new sphere, or if they are, or if they're not, or if it's going to stay online in various different versions. I'm really not sure. Um, so any last words, Paul, that you would like to say?
Yeah, I mean, just to wrap, thank you, Andy, and thank you everybody for being here. Hope you enjoy the report. We were asked to look at the sort of things that were priorities in terms of research or in terms of innovation for humanitarian WASH, taking the points that have been made about how humanitarian it is and the nexus and the overlap with development and long-term programming, but for humanitarian WASH in to address the challenges of climate change. And through this process that Andy's described, that's what we tried to do. Came up with these 11 areas. If there were any overarching things that we came out of it from, I think maybe there would be three. The first is that a lot of the things, and you pointed this out already, but a lot of the challenges that need looking at are not exclusively climate specific. They are pre-existing WASH challenges that get turbocharged by climate change. So, for example, needing to know more about what works, which is one of them. In fact, many of them are strongly related to the status quo without adding additional climate change. So that was one of the things that came out of it. I think the second thing that came out, and we've touched on this already, was that, okay, so now we know what the gaps are. In terms of how do we respond, it was interesting how many of the gaps were not about technology. They were about how humans interact with the technology and the management of the technology and the processes, and that the human part in the system around water and sanitation. And I think we were surprised by that. But it did come out very, very strongly from the process that we used. And the third thing, and we'll finish here, was there was a gap, a very clear gap between information that is already available, like the vector piece, for example, that we are just speaking to, and colleagues' knowledge on the ground of information that was available. So there was a gap opening up between research and practice. Um, and in moving forward, we would very strongly recommend, obviously, to any donors in the room or any researchers in the room, that you look at these areas and focus on these areas. But we would also very strongly recommend that everything possible is done to bring all of the work that's going on in academe and in capitals and, the sort of things that we were talking about there, to bring it as closely as possible to the work that's being done on the ground. Because it's fine for us to come up with 11 areas for research, but if the research isn't actualized in that borehole, then there's really not very much point. So bringing those two things together was a very strong element. Those, I think, were parting ideas. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending. V, I don't know if you had any final.
Just to say thank you very much for joining our session today, and also thank you to the research team that delivered and led this very critical piece of work. So thank you, Paul, Andy, and Laurence, also to Raisa, who isn't here today, but also for the engaging discussion and comments and questions from everybody today. And with that, I think it is probably time for us to wrap up. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of World Water Week.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.